everyone, welcome to our second Zooming Out, building off our very successful series called Zoomin In last year. This year we're zooming out with global alumni from various places around the world. I'm so pleased to be able to talk to Mohamed El Roubi, class of 1999 today. Mohamed, welcome.
Thank you, Mielle. It's nice to be with you.
Yes, this will be fun. I'm looking forward to our conversation. First, I want to give you a little bit of background about Mohamed's experiences, and then we will visit some places that Mohamed enjoys and visits often, and we'll do a little bit of Q&A after that. So a little bit about Mohamed's background. He's an independent board consultant. He's in Canberra, Australia. He is an experienced executive and general counsel, and a specialist in business resilience, corporate restructuring, M&A, and issues management. He has broad legal governance, risk and compliance experience across a range of industries operating in multi-jurisdictional context. As a successful member of senior executive management teams at Orascom Telecom, General Electric, Amy Foster Wheeler, and Garda World, Mohamed has contributed to business strategy and management beyond functional responsibilities and has provided impactful legal support for countless initiatives over 22 years. Mohamed has worked extensively throughout 5 continents and has a particular focus on complex and ambiguous legal and operating environments, including the Middle East and Africa. Mohamed has led large 40-plus multidisciplined legal and compliance functions in complex matrices across various cultures and geographies. He has a proven track record of identifying, managing, developing talented lawyers and compliance professionals. He's bilingual with English and Arabic. He's a Northeastern Law grad, which we know. He has both corporate and private practice experience and is admitted to practice as an attorney, counselor at law in Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. He's a thought leader and a regular conference speaker on corporate governance and business ethics. And he's also an experienced independent non-executive director, a fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia, and a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He's married with 2 children and lives in Canberra, Australia. He is not admitted yet to practice law in Australia, but he's working on satisfying the requirements for admission as a lawyer in New South Wales. So welcome, Mohamed. That's really an interesting background. You've done a lot of different types of work in your 22 years. And I want to see a little bit about some of your favorite places.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the introduction, Mielle. And first of all, let me take a moment to say that I'm joining you, obviously, from Canberra, but Canberra is Ngunnawal country. This is the traditional Aboriginal name for this area. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is an Australian custom that we do here. Canberra is actually a Ngunnawal word meaning meeting place. So it's a real pleasure to meet you, all of you, from here, even virtually. And as I said, this is an Australian custom that we do. The Aboriginal culture is the world's oldest living culture, 60,000 plus years, scientifically proven. And the land that we are on, I'm sat in a federal territory, the Australian Capital Territory. It's the capital of Australia, surrounded by 1 state out of 6. And there are 6 states and 2 federal territories in Australia. But actually, I'm surrounded by 4 other Aboriginal countries. Wow. Out of more than 500 across Australia. So we sometimes forget, and I think it behooves us to remember, that Australia is a very, very old country, not as Australia, but a multitude of diverse cultures and peoples.
Wonderful. I love that. I love that welcome and acknowledgement of that. It's nice. It's nice that you did that. So we're going to take a peek at some slides next. And why don't you tell us a little bit about each one that we see? We have Mount Taylor coming up first.
So this is actually out the back of my house.
Wow.
It's the nature reserve closest to me, so I get to go for walks there. And this is a fairly special place for me because it's one of the places that my children brought me when I first arrived in Canberra. I was separated from my wife and children for about 2.5 months because of the pandemic. I managed to get them out of Dubai in March 2020, and then I stayed behind with our 2 cats. Took a while to reconnect.
Wow.
And when I arrived, obviously they were already settled in school and they knew their neighborhood, and they brought me up to this place to sort of show me their new domain. And so it has a particularly special meaning for me. It's not the top of Mount Taylor by any stretch of the imagination, so it goes up a little bit higher. But behind me there, you can see Black Mountain, which has the Telstra Tower on it,
Yep.
which is frequently used as an iconic image of Canberra. And what I love about this as well is that it just shows that people call Canberra the bush capital. It is in the heart of the bush, and this is typical Australian bushland, lots of gum trees and other things that we'll see in a moment, I think.
Beautiful. Is your wife Australian?
She is, yes.
Okay.
That's how I end up here.
I thought so, but I wasn't 100% sure. Okay, pronounce this for me.
Jerrabomberra
Jerrabomberra.
wetlands. This is another nature reserve here in the territory. And this was a photo I took. This was actually New Year's Day 2021. It's the middle of summer. You wouldn't think it from the overcast skies. But it just sort of had this feeling for me of sort of an impressionist painting, a very peaceful place. And all of the Australian Capital Territory is the size of Luxembourg, the entire territory. So it's very small. It's easy to get around. You sort of step out your door and turn right, and you'll find a place like this to sort of walk and contemplate and meditate in. And this is one of my favorites.
It's beautiful. Do you need 4-wheel drive to get around in some of these?
No, I mean, Australians love their 4-wheel drives, or utes as we call them. You know, it's the sort of image of the outback, etc. But in reality, you know, this is a very, despite the appearances, all the roads are good. It's a fairly urban center. It's not like remote or regional Australia, which is a very different story. And I think we might even talk a little bit about that coming up.
Okay, let's see what's next, Jen. Oh goodness, Tinbinbilla.
Tidbinbilla.
How did I do it?
I think no slide deck of Australia would be complete without a koala and maybe even a kangaroo. But this photo I took, sadly, this is not a koala and joey in the wild. They are actually in a reserve, and they were in an enclosed part of the reserve being cared for. I think if you look behind them, you can see charring on the trees and the barks of the trees, even though there's a lot of lush greenery that's grown up around it. You know, Australia is very prone to bushfires, like California and various other places around the world. And we've had a very bad run of it as a result of climate change. In the Black Summer bushfires, which was the summer of 2019-2020, there was an estimated 60,000 koalas killed or affected by the bushfires. And a report that came out yesterday says that actually Australia has lost 30% of its koala population in the last 3 years. So their plight is very serious, and it's very tied to climate change, to the changing, the heat, the forest fires, the droughts, etc., which is affecting their habitat. And unfortunately, Australia lags far behind the OECD and other developed countries in tackling this seriously. We still have a government that has refused to commit to net zero by 2050. I think if you watch COP26 in Glasgow in a couple of weeks or whenever it is, you'll see some interesting discussions about Australia's commitments or lack thereof. And so this photo is, first of all, obviously a very cute photo of a koala and her baby, a joey, but it also speaks a lot more to me and about, you know, how much more we need to go and do.
Wow, that sort of surprises me about Australia. It's such a beautiful country. I would think they would be on top of climate change.
You'd think, but unfortunately, economics gets in the way. This is a country that is reliant on egg mining, large pastoral interests, farming, export of carbon generating minerals like coal, especially thermal coal. So this photo here is a typical scene.
Yeah, so
Rush
cute.
hour in Canberra. You sort of again, like I said, no slide deck of Australia would be complete without some kangaroos. But the collective term for kangaroos is a mob, like
Okay.
the mob.
Yeah.
And if you've ever come across a big angry male kangaroo, you'll probably find them quite thuggish and think that that's probably an appropriate term for a group of kangaroos. But the word mob also has a significance in Aboriginal culture. It's a word that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people used to refer to their groups of people. And I've avoided specifically using words tribes or clans or things like that that have a sort of Western concept to them. But it's people, it's beyond family, as it is family, of course, and it's larger than family, larger than immediate family. But it's a group of people who share the same connection to country. And we say the word country, not the country, because country is a spiritual concept as well as a physical reality. So, you know, aside from, so, you know, it's something that's this connection to the land that's so spiritual. And these guys reminded me a little bit of sort of a spiritual connection to the land, I suppose, in this photo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you run across them in your everyday life, or no, you'd have to be on in a reserve or?
No, yeah, you do run across them. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and you find they've done their business on your lawn, and sadly they are, you know, a serious traffic risk. You have to be very careful, like in parts of the US with, you know, deer or whatever.
Moose, yeah.
Because they are, yeah, and in the Middle East with camels, but they are, you know, obviously they jump, they hop,
yeah.
They hop across the road at great speed, and they can be, you know, obviously a serious risk to them, serious risk to you, and you know, it's. But yes, you do see them very, very frequently.
All right, next, Federal Parliament.
Federal Parliament. This is actually the flagpole atop the Federal Parliament. This is you can take a picture of the Australian Federal Parliament, the seat of Australian democracy, from many angles. You can get it looking across the lake with nice manicured lawns leading up to it, and you wouldn't think that there was any bush around it. This view is from the bush side. And it's a modern building. There is an older Federal Parliament building from 1910 or so, and you know, that's been outgrown. As I said, this is the seat of Australian democracy. People talk about the Canberra bubble, stuff that happens here that people wouldn't believe if it happened anywhere else. And the Australian Federal Parliament has been in the news a lot lately for the wrong reasons, particularly in respect of respect for women, workplace culture, sexual assault and things like that. Unfortunately, it's been the scene of some rather horrendous events. And, you know, it's another thing that I think surprises a lot of people about Australia as a liberal Western democracy, is that in some respects they're still very far behind. But as I said, it's a seat of Australian democracy. Australia, unlike the US, doesn't have full separation of powers. It's you know, the principle of responsible government. So you have to be a minister, you have to be a member of parliament. So the executive and the legislative are combined, and they sit there.
Wow.
And the separation of powers is with the judiciary only, the pure separation of powers.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you shared this slide. Next up, we have the National Arboretum. Also gorgeous.
Yeah, another very beautiful spot in Canberra. And of course, being the national capital, we have a lot of places like the National Zoo and the National Arboretum. Here they have a collection of trees from many different places around the world. This is a fabulous vantage point to look across Canberra. You can't see it, but we're actually looking towards the Federal Parliament and Lake Burley Griffin. Canberra as the capital is a little bit like Washington, DC. It was a manufactured capital, if you like, made by political agreement. There was some debate as to whether it should be closer, should be in Sydney or closer to Sydney, or whether it should be in Melbourne or closer to Melbourne. In the end, they agreed to put it here. We're completely surrounded by New South Wales, the capital of which is Sydney. But there's a rule in the Constitution that we can't be closer than 100, capital of Australia can't be closer than 100 kilometers from. I think there was a bit of between Melbourne and Sydney there. It's an old rivalry. It played out in terms of where the capital should sit, but it's one of my favorite views as well.
You know quite a bit about Australian history already. I'm very impressed. Now we have the university.
This is why I know a little bit about Australian history, because I'm in the process of requalifying as a lawyer here, if you like, or gaining admission as a lawyer here. As you know, I qualified and I was admitted to Massachusetts, and I waved into DC when I worked there. And so coming here, I had to have my Northeastern degree assessed by the Legal Profession Admission Board, and they decided that I needed to take 4 additional courses.
Wow.
I had to take Australian constitutional law, I had to take Australian administrative law, I had to take equity, and bizarrely, I had to take property, which really, really annoyed me because I hated property and I had nightmares of Phyllis Bauman back in the day. And, you know, I pulled out my old transcript actually yesterday and I read, you know, Phyllis Bauman's grading, the assessment of my exam. And she said, you know, that I confused a symbolic and a constructive gift. But I can tell you now, I now know the difference between a symbolic and a constructive gift because I've done it all again. One of the reasons why they made me do property again is because of one of Australia's greatest exports to the world, which is the Torrens land registration system, which came out of South Australia and is the system of moving away from the English deeds conveyancing system, where you have to have a chain of deeds leading all the way back to the king, to a real folio system of registration. And I was a little bit annoyed that that was the reason I had to take property again, because, you know, that's something you can read in about 2 minutes and understand. I also did work on that in my very first co-op. I went to Palestine, worked with the Palestinian Authority. And one of the jobs that I had to do in 1997 was for the International Finance Corporation to you know, when the IFC sort of finances or works on legal infrastructure reform in developing countries, they're always interested in implementing the Torrens land registration system.
How do you spell that,
I've
Mohamed?
done this work. Sorry?
How do you spell that, Torrens?
Torrens.
Okay.
And the funny thing about the Torrens land registration system is it was Sir Robert Torrens, who was obviously, he was actually a Welshman, came to South Australia. He was quite a prickly character. He wasn't a very pleasant person. But he had his family, parts of his family being ruined by land transactions under the old English deed system. He wanted a better way to do it. The actual concept is German, of a real folio system, and it comes out of the Hanseatic states. So he found a German guy who'd escaped persecution in Europe and made his way to South Australia with their grapes, and they started making fantastic wine in South Australia. And together they came up with this real folio land registration system. But what I really learned in property at the University of Canberra was about native title, which is Indigenous land claims and the history of the you know, disenfranchisement and racism and everything that happened in Australia since white settlement. And that was really eye-opening to me. And one of the things that I you know, I asked my professor, I said, I'm being made to take this course because I have to learn about the Torrens land registration system, and nobody even mentioned native title. And she said to me, she said, Mohamed, they don't care. And it really saddened me because, you know, it really should be a focus for anybody. Unfortunately, the University of Canberra, they make it a focus, a lot like Northeastern. This is a university that is geared towards producing practicing lawyers, practical lawyers with a conscience. So it reminded me a lot of Northeastern, and actually this photo physically reminded me of Northeastern.
Yeah.
The layout of the buildings, the bricks, I don't know, this reminded me a little bit of Krentzman Quadrangle or something, I don't know.
A little bit of home. Are you done with all your coursework now?
I'm done with the academic part. I now need to go back and see what they want me to do for practical legal training.
Oh, more practical
Unfortunately,
legal
it's
training.
practical legal training. So
More.
after 22 years of being a lawyer, I'm going to have to do some practical. So I have another sort of exemptions process to apply for, and then see from there how we go.
Very
What they'll make me do
interesting.
next.
What do we have up next, Jen? Okay, we're going to do a little bit different on this Zooming Out. We're going to take a peek at some career highlights, because you're taking a little break, right? Career-wise, to do this, sitting
That's
for
right.
this new training and your local lawyer credentials. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about this, and then following that, we're going to ask some specific questions of Mohamed. So what is happening here, Mohamed?
Well, this I'm about to get shaken down by the U.S. military in Baghdad in 2003. There's obviously a bit of a gap between 1999 and 2003, and how I ended up in Baghdad. And when I came to Northeastern, I knew nothing really about Northeastern. I'd never been to Boston. I got off the plane and I came to orientation, and I really didn't do a lot of homework. I was very young. I was 21 years old. I was coming from Egypt, and I was very young in other ways. I started university when I was extremely young. I was 15 when I started my bachelor's degree. I got that at 19. I was still very young, so I did a master's degree, which took me to 21. And then I had an opportunity to either go into banking in the Gulf in Abu Dhabi, or I had this idea of maybe studying law. Which came about through some of the extracurricular activities I did as a student at the American University in Cairo. But there were no lawyers in my family. I had no idea what being a lawyer was. I was in the American system, so there was no going back and sort of doing it in Egypt. It was go to the US, or if you want to be a lawyer. And I'd met a political science professor from Northeastern through some of my student activities called Dennis Sullivan. And he said, if you're going to study law and you look at Northeastern, it's a great university, and, I'm there and I can help you out. And so this idea, sort of formed, and I applied. I actually stupidly applied for a joint degree program in law policy, and I think it was law policy and society, PhD and JD. I also applied to other law schools. I was accepted to Northeastern and Washington University in St. Louis. I'd never been to Boston. I'd never seen Northeastern, but I'd been to St. Louis and I didn't like it. So that made my mind up. So
you
I came
made the
to
right
Northeastern.
choice.
Absolutely. And the co-op program was so important in that as well, because it's the sort of the unstructured learning part of things. And being unstructured, you get to sort of do your own thing. So I had a big interest in international law. I would never have said that Northeastern was a hub for international law studies, but the ability to sort of tailor your own sort of program, particularly around the co-ops. So my first co-op, I went to Palestine. I worked with the Palestinian Authority. Then I did a co-op with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Egypt, doing eligibility determination and resettlement for refugees. And then I clerked with a justice of the Supreme Constitutional Court in Egypt on my third co-op. And then finally, my only co-op that I did in the US was with UNHCR in Washington. And even there, I found every opportunity to get out of the US, and I was able to do an assessment mission with the regional protection officer on the Dominican-Haitian border. We took a land cruiser from the north all the way down to the south. So it was probably inevitable that at some point I would find myself in a conflict zone like Baghdad, Iraq, with staring down an American soldier who had a tip-off that Saddam
fascinating, Mohamed. Those co-ops are incredible.
Well, it could only be at Northeastern, right? Because if you only have your summers in a traditional legal program to sort of figure out what you want to do, you have the pressure of law school debt, you have the pressure of trying to get a summer associateship, not wanting to waste, it's only at Northeastern that I think this could have worked out for me. And I was headed for a career in
no, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say I was headed for a career in public international law. I was thinking the UN. And actually, my first job was doing pure public international law. I got a big law job at LaBeouf, Lamb, Greene and McRae, subsequently doing LaBeouf and subsequently bankrupt. Nothing to do with me, I'm happy to say. But you know, LaBeouf, Lamb, Greene and McRae was known for energy regulatory work and reinsurance and insurance litigation. But within that little Washington office were a couple of former State Department ambassadors, one of whom was the former head of the legal department at the State Department, and they had formed a international boundary dispute practice group. So my first job was actually representing states, or helping to represent states in international border disputes. We had two clients, Saudi Arabia, for all their borders, but principally the main one was Yemen, and Equatorial Guinea, which was an intervention in an International Court of Justice case between Nigeria and Cameroon over the maritime border. So this international interest in public international law started early, and I was headed down that path. And then Saudi Arabia settled their border dispute with Yemen. And that was kind of the end of my public international law work. I got sort of shoved into corporate oil and gas. I got sent to Saudi Arabia. I left Saudi Arabia, I went to Egypt, and then 2003 and the Iraq War happened. And I was about to go back to Saudi Arabia, and the partner that I worked for in the law firm in Egypt, where I'd been doing corporate law, said to me, "Don't go to Saudi, come with me to Iraq. You know, it's not every day the world's only remaining superpower," which it was at the time, makes a mistake and lands in a country like Iraq and is committed to rebuild it. And we have a real natural advantage as Egyptian lawyers, because Iraqi law is based on Egyptian law, which is based on French law. The reconstruction process that was about to start in Iraq was going to be, you know, in many ways similar to the reconstruction that happened in Egypt after the Camp David Accords, after peace with Israel. So 3 days later, he convinced me. 2 weeks after that, I was in Baghdad. And then here we are, you know, after a tip-off that, Saddam Hussein was hiding in the hotel apartments that I was living in. We got raided by the US military, and here they were just about to sort of have a look in our room. It's not as confronting as it seems. It was all very polite and decent, but that's me in Iraq.
Wow.
So
far it's fascinating. Oh, I can't pronounce this. Pronounce this for me.
Sulaymaniyah. So Sulaymaniyah is one of 3 provinces in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. And now I'm a few years in. What I'd done with my partner from Egypt in Iraq was set up a law firm. We got an Iraqi partner, and we set up sort of the first Western style international law firm, you know, operating across Iraq. I was principally based in Baghdad, and I'd sort of shunned Kurdistan a little bit. It was very quiet and very safe, and by all rights I should have been there, but I was quite busy down in the south. And the gentleman and sort of, you know, the other gentleman at the time was the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. He's now the President of Iraq, Barham Saleh, a very senior Kurdish politician. His wife is next to him, and the lady next to me is my dear late aunt, Dorea Aouni, who was a very significant and very courageous Kurdish journalist and activist.
Wow.
And until the very end, you know, of her life, and particularly through the Syria conflict and everything that happened with the Kurds in Syria, she continued to advocate very ferociously for Kurdish identity and rights. I miss her very much, obviously, but here we were in Kurdistan, and she was just, this was her element. So she picked up the phone. It was Friday. We were going from Erbil to Sulaymaniyah, two different provinces. And she picked up the phone to Deputy Prime Minister and said, "We'll be there for lunch." You know, he didn't have a choice.
Wow.
So there we were.
Sometimes that works best.
Exactly.
Next picture. Let's see. Pyongyang,
North Korea. So an
2010.
iconic image. I think now there is a second statue next to this one. This is the statue of Kim Il-sung, the founder of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, or North Korea as we call it. And in Iraq, one of my first clients was Orascom Telecom, the Egyptian telecommunications company. Their profile was building mobile phone networks in places other people don't want to go. So we built the first mobile phone network in the central region of Iraq, and then the largest network in Iraq. I helped them and handled all their legal work from setting up, obtaining a license and setting up in country, all the way through to the sale of the network 4 years later when they failed to sort of win the auction for the next license. But Naguib Sawiris, who's the Egyptian billionaire who owns Orascom, was always looking for the next opportunity, and North Korea for him was an opportunity. And so he acquired the license to build the first mobile phone network in partnership with the North Korean government. And I was the lawyer who was responsible for supporting the operation and negotiating with the North Koreans. So I went twice, sadly both times in winter, which was a bad idea. And on one visit, I had to pay my respects. These are my two handlers, the sort of charmless handlers that you get assigned in North Korea.
Yep.
They bought me some flowers. I had to go place them at the statue, and that's the story there.
You're
but
required
absolutely
to.
fascinating. I was required to.
Yeah.
I was required to. I of course I was happy to be respectful to an extent, but then I had this awkward moment when I went up and I placed the flowers at the foot of the statue. And I was like, well, what do I do now? If I turn my back on the statue, am I insulting someone?
Right.
So I gingerly took a few steps backwards, and then turned around, and then we took a photo and everything was fine. But it was certainly one of the more interesting projects that I, for almost 2 years, I supported building this network, which was the first of its kind. And really, I think a lot of cynical people would say, well, you're helping dictators, you're helping people who, violate human rights. But I think underneath that is, if you give people the power to communicate and the ability to communicate, you start change. So I always try to look at, even as doing, these kinds of projects in ambiguous, complex jurisdictions, was to look for the bigger picture.
Yeah, when I read about complex jurisdictions, I didn't know how complex they were, Mohamed.
Some are more complex than others.
Yes. So you were there for 2 years, on and off?
Yeah, I went to North Korea twice actually during that period. But in the meantime, I met with my counterparts from the Korean Telecommunications and Post Company, the national telecoms company of the DPRK. I met with them several times between those two trips, in one time in Egypt, one time in China, one time in Rome, sort of wherever they could get visas, we'd meet up. And by the time I went back the second time, I was, it was a very different reception. I didn't have to have handlers. I could go around on my own.
Wow.
It was a very different situation. But by this point, I was already in-house, so I was a company lawyer. I was no longer in private practice. And I started in telecoms. I then moved to GE, and I spent just a little over 2 years at GE, first as general counsel for GE Energy for the Middle East. And then I was promoted to be the general counsel for all the GE businesses across the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, and Pakistan, which was a $10 billion region.
Yeah, that's an enormous job.
A big job in a great company. And, it's, I always say that in my career, there's sort of different points where I learn things in my in-house career. And with Orascom Telecom, I learned about agility and risk-taking and sort of, moving quickly and making things happen. And I was living in Italy at the time with Orascom Telecom. They bought into Italy, so I was living in Rome. In fact, my 2 children in Rome. And I was going out from Rome to places like North Korea. So it's quite a juxtaposition. And that kind of came to an end, unfortunately, because of, the risk ultimately overtook the operation when we had the expropriatory tax claim in Algeria that it's highly leveraged business. The business had to be sold ultimately to get out of the problem, and that an opportunity with GE came along. Now, both Terascom and GE were clients of mine in Iraq. And so I wasn't, I wasn't unfamiliar to GE, but what GE taught me was, core competence in governance, compliance, working truly, what it means to do business with ethics and integrity, and functional leadership. And in that process, I had these big roles, and I worked on some, a year in GE is like 10 in any other company.
Right.
You're just moving at such a pace and with such scale. But I was still the Middle East guy. And I was stuck in the Middle East, and it's a little bit like being an actor. I'm trying to convince people that I can be John Malkovich. I can do drama, I can do comedy, I can do, I can do international, I can do, even though I'd been in Europe before and I'd sat in the boardroom of European companies and I dealt with European regulators, I was still Mohamed, speaking Arabic, sat in the Middle East, and that's where, people felt might be the best place for me. It's like they say, you're not Malkovich, you're Jim Carrey, you're the cable guy.
You got a little bit pigeonholed.
A little bit pigeonholed.
Yeah.
So I was keen to spread my wings a little bit. And an opportunity came along with this British engineering company, AMEC Foster Wheeler. It was AMEC at the time, it was a FTSE 100 company. And, they were serving the mining, clean energy, environment and infrastructure, and sort of power and process markets. They also did some, oil and gas markets. They also did some nuclear work and Sellafield and places like that in the UK. I was able to secure this fairly, again, a super region. It was called Growth Region, so Middle East, Africa, CIS, Asia Pacific, and then a global business that principally did design build for the US military under the Environment and Infrastructure Project. So
is that where we are here?
That's where we are here. So this is part of the mining business. So the company had a very large, project management contract with Swakop Uranium. We're down in Namibia. This is the world's second largest uranium mine in the world. I don't know if that's the world's second largest digger in the world. It could be
one of the biggest I've ever. It's one of the biggest I've ever seen.
So I'm dwarfed by the bucket there, and I made it a point throughout my career, and I think I learned this at GE, because in GE we were always talking about, when it comes to governance and compliance, one of the main things that you're concerned about is remote location risk. And there are no more remote locations than mining sites or oil and gas rigs, out at sea or out in the desert or something like that. And that's where you really get, sort of the rubber hits the road with bad behavior and compliance issues and things like that. So I made it a point when I took on this new role that I was going to be as close to the operation as possible and really see and understand what they're doing, so that it's not just theoretical. I'm not sitting here doing contract reviews. I'm, going to be front facing. So I just piggyback with executives, and we'd fly out to, these places. And of course, for me, it's fantastic, right? It's the first time I've ever been to Namibia. It's a fabulous country if you ever get to go.
It looks like you've been around the globe so far. Wow, this is beautiful. Ghana.
Ghana's a fabulous country as well. I loved my trips there. Those trips this time was negotiating, a new joint venture. Ghana, like many countries in Africa and across the world even, driving local content requirements. No longer interested in foreign companies just coming, taking contracts and not leaving anything impactful behind. So the rules started to change in the petroleum industry. There's an oil rig there just off the coast of Takoradi. I like this photo because I managed to capture the sort of traditional fishing boat that's moving in front of it. And it was just as a squall came in as well. So the weather was really quite rough. And we were sat having lunch with our soon-to-be Ghanaian partner that we were creating this joint venture with. And, this was, for me, this was an essential part of the due diligence as understanding who you're doing business with, a key part of compliance, especially in parts of the world where, beautiful as they are and as fabulous as the people are, when it comes to transparency, when it comes to governance, when it comes to corruption and things like that, you have fairly significant risks. The US Department of Justice is the leader under the FCPA in prosecuting these kinds of, when things go wrong in this area. And so again, another great opportunity to do the work and the due diligence side, get to know your new partners, but also to see a beautiful part of the world.
Absolutely. Azerbaijani, beautiful parliament building there.
Yes, and I think I was being a little bit poetic with my photos and trying to, believe it or not, I'm not on Instagram, so I never take these for Instagram. They're more just for me. But I also spent a lot of time in Azerbaijan. This time, not for the front end of what I do. The front end of what I do in terms of business resilience and governance and compliance is making sure that the business is structured properly, is set up properly, has all the right controls in, that the controls work, that they're operationalized, that people know what they need to do. A lot of my trips to Azerbaijan were all on one project, which was actually when something had gone horribly wrong. And it was actually a fairly significant fraud that had happened in the business through collusion of two local finance people. They managed to, steal $38 million over 10 years without anybody noticing. And it was within my business, so I had to deal with that. And part of dealing with that meant taking it to local prosecutors, getting the people arrested, working on asset recovery, asset tracing and asset recovery, because we found the money was laundered through 14 different countries around the world, as is often the case, and had gone into properties in London and properties in Dubai, and some very expensive handbags and various other things that we were trying to recover. So on something like this, when I talk about business resilience in particular, is also structuring the business properly to be able to weather a storm like that, sure, and then getting it out on the other end and improving the controls, improving the systems, and also training people. We're moving far beyond a situation in governance and compliance now, where you used to have tick the box sort of, do you have the window dressing, do you have the policies and the procedures, have you trained people, have they done their online training? We're now moving to a world where, first of all, we've gone through the UK's legislative efforts into a world of not just actively being involved in something like fraud or corruption, but failing to prevent. So this class of laws that have come out in the UK of failing to prevent bribery as a corporate crime. And there was a project or a legislative initiative to create a law to the failure to prevent economic crime, that the corporate could be liable for. We moved into that, which is a completely different world and requires a completely, you've got to go much further than paper. And now we're moving into a new world, which maybe, you've heard about on the privacy space in particular, and, this idea of privacy by design. We're now moving into the world of governance by design, compliance by design. In New South Wales, the work health and safety laws are moving into welfare by design. So even on mental health, for example, if you run a hospital and you have to do a risk assessment, if there's a risk, for example, that people could be mentally traumatized by verbal attacks from patients, you have to design controls into your system to address that. You can't just sort of have an employee assistance program. Yeah. So these were when I approach now my board work, I approach it with a lot of background from real life situations that I experienced and saw. You know, the Azerbaijani one, you know, how someone can get around controls, what are some of the vectors of risk, you know, when you're coming to evaluate, you know, an operation, where are the risks really of economic crime, of human trafficking, of whatever the risk that you might be dealing with. All too often boards focus on financial risk.
Right.
We try to push people to focus on non-financial risks, reputational risks, real cultural risks, and the impact of the operation on, you know, society at large. Because a lot of people view bribery, corruption, fraud, white-collar crime. Who cares if a company's lost a few million, you know, dollars? But the money goes somewhere. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't just go into someone's pocket. It has to be laundered. It gets laundered through criminal organized crime networks that are also trafficking people, that are enslaving people, that are, you know, engaged in prostitution, engaged in, you know, degradement of women and all kinds of other things. So, you know, it's not an abstract thing. It's not a harmless crime. It has real impacts. And of course, in countries like Azerbaijan or Ghana or Nigeria or Iraq or Afghanistan, it has real impact on everyday people's lives in those countries. It perpetuates poverty. So focusing people's minds on compliance, boards' minds on compliance by design, on the broader impact, on the non-financial risks has been a key part of what I've been doing off some of these experiences that I suppose was privileged to have to deal with. Right. This was the first time I had someone arrested in my job. I know we have a lot of alumni who are in law enforcement and you know, attorneys general and things like that. It's not something you get to do often as a sort of, you know, corporate lawyer, but it was certainly an interesting experience.
Wonderful. It sounds like you bring a lot of your Northeastern ethos to your board work. When you're thinking about the larger situation, the impacts, who else will this, you know, shape or change? And it's just good to hear that you're looking at some of this work with a different viewpoint.
Well, I came to Northeastern, as I said, very young, very naive. And, you know, I was really, you know, one of the things that I'm really grateful for is all my colleagues at Northeastern, because they really opened my mind, and they continue to open my mind today. You know, I'm not very active on social media, but I follow people on social media, and Northeastern alums that I'm connected with on Facebook, for example, you know, talking about Black Lives Matter, you know, it's constantly informing about me, about racism, about, you know, things that I need to challenge myself to think about, you know, whatever it is, with LGBTQI issues and matters like that. It's constantly challenging me and opening my mind. And I try to bring that, obviously, into the corporate work that I'm doing, because I think it's easy for people to think that there's two ways to make an impact. You either go and you sort of do public interest work, pure public interest work, or, you know, or you go into the corporate world and you're sort of lost to profit. Corporations are a big part of our lives, and arguably probably the biggest part of our lives in terms of everything that we're dealing with in terms of social change. They have a massive role to play, positive or negative. And so if you're not driving that agenda, moving that needle, whether it's on things like modern slavery, and this photo is, you know, evocative for me. That's not what's going on here, I'm happy to tell you, but it is an industry that has those kinds of risks in it. You know, you can really make a difference, and you can have a very rewarding career as well. And, you know, it's like I said, I thought when I graduated from Northeastern, I was trying to find my way into the UN. I wanted to be in UNHCR, you know, doing public international law, out on the front lines of whatever conflict, etc. And I went a completely different path, but I like to think that I sort of hopefully came to a similar place in terms of the impact that I could have made, the potential impact that I have had when I graduated. That's my hope. And
yeah, it sounds like your background and your college experiences married the two a bit. So some of your background and some of your training at Northeastern married the two. So tell me what's happening here.
Yeah, so this was definitely one of the more interesting periods of my career. So having been a telecoms guy, an oil and gas, an industry guy, you know, sort of big industrial manufacturing and GE, then going into engineering and construction, I now found myself working for a private security company. I had done very well with AMEC Foster Wheeler. I'd ascended to lofty heights, as they say. I was the number 2 in the legal department, the assistant general counsel for operations. So I sat across all the business facing lawyers, of more than 40 of them, across the world. I had a team that, you know, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd speak with Shanghai and Perth, and I'd end my day speaking with Santiago and Vancouver. And that was a fabulous experience. But unfortunately, while my career was going up in the company's fortunes were going down, principally on the back of, you know, a rather difficult acquisition of Foster Wheeler, which turned out right on the cusp of the sort of commodities, oil price going down and commodity prices going down. And the company never recovered and ultimately was taken over by Wood Group. By that point, I was out with the rest of the senior sort of leadership. I had a pause for a few months and then got a job with GardaWorld, which is the largest privately owned private security company. You may, if you live in parts of the US, you may see GardaWorld armored trucks driving around delivering cash to ATMs. That's one of the things they do. If you fly through Toronto Pearson International Airport, you'll be the TSA at Toronto Pearson are GardaWorld people. That's another thing that they do. The international business that I became the general counsel for did a whole host of things. They did very complex, high-risk security for diplomatic operations, U.S. Embassy in Kabul and Baghdad, and, you know, the British Embassy in Kabul, Baghdad, and Libya and Somalia, the Australian embassies in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was part of the business. Another part of the business was the special risks business, special risk consulting, as it's called. And this is a very niche part of it's funded by insurance. You buy insurance for these kinds of risks, and it covers everything from kidnap for ransom to extortion to cyber extortion to, you know, all those kinds of risks, even, you know, hijacking of vessels. You know, you take insurance against that risk, and then there's a consultant who responds when that risk arises. And that was part of the business as well. In Africa, however, the business was largely around man guarding, unarmed, secure, or in this case, a tea plantation. This is actually a Unilever tea plantation in Kericho, Kenya. So that's Lipton tea there. And I just thought it was a fabulous picture. You've got the pickers there picking tea and just a fabulous day, again, seeing the operations and trying to understand what the risks are. Now, if you're doing security for an operation like that, one of the risks that you have is the proper, you know, managing the proper escalation of the use of force and responding to things like poor people who come and try to steal some tea. You can't have guards having a heavy-handed response. They have to know exactly how to respond to those kinds of situations. Otherwise, you end up with, you know, horrible situations. And the same in the mining industry, where you have gold mines and you have artisanal miners who sort of come on and try to take a bit of gold. Securing those kinds of operations that are very large like that bring with them very specific risks, and a corporate governance and compliance program that properly evaluates those risks, manages them, ensures that people are trained properly, and has proper engagement with local communities is key. So a fabulous trip through Kenya. Africa was always one of my favorite places to travel around in. Not so easy to move around in, but always a beautiful experience.
It looks gorgeous. Dubai through the clouds?
9 years spent in Dubai.
Really?
It was moved there from Italy, as I said, in 2011 to join GE, and stayed there until 2020. So traveled the world from there. And this photo is, I took it on an early morning approach to Dubai International Airport. It was a foggy morning in Dubai, which often happens. I think this was February, it happens in winter. And you can see the Burj Khalifa poking out above the fog there and dwarfing everything else, every other building, many of which are also record holders of their own. It was very difficult. We were ready to leave Dubai. This wasn't a pandemic move. We'd had this planned, but then the pandemic took over. And so after 9 years of Dubai, I was quite sad with the way that I ultimately ended up leaving, which was on a repatriation flight. I'm not Australian, so I emigrated to Australia on a government repatriation flight with 27 people on a Boeing 787,
Wow.
in the middle of the night, straight into quarantine in Melbourne for 14 days, and I joked a little bit about it at the time. I sort of said, well, my experience moving to Australia is a sort of a quintessentially British experience. It takes months to get here. It's just like in the old days in the 1700s. It takes months to get here, and you arrive as a detainee, because of course Australia was a convict colony for England. So I literally, when I arrived and was being taken to quarantine, I was served with a notice of detention, and that's how my chapter here in Australia started. But it was a sad goodbye to Dubai in lockdown, and this photo for me, really brings back happy memories of always coming home to my family, and from trips wherever I'd been. I did travel a lot during that time, and sort of the promise of Dubai in a photo there.
So you spent the longest amount of time here, is that right?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it wasn't intended to be that way. I always thought that Dubai would be a 3 to 5 with good behavior. But it actually, was really, really quite a long time. And three worked for 3 companies from there, doing global, super regional roles. And it was good. It was a good time.
So where did you meet your wife?
We met in Baghdad. So
Okay.
Around the time that first photo was taken, the photo of the US soldiers about to raid my room, my wife was an aid worker, and she was trying to help in Iraq.
Yeah.
And we were living in that same hotel together. Many weird and wonderful characters that I met in that hotel. I have some lifelong friends, wonderful people like my wife. The weird people like Benon Seban, if people remember that name. He was the head of the Oil for Food program. And at the time, the UN was based there, the senior UN people. He and I used to sit in the evenings and smoke shishas, bubbly water pipes. And I had no idea he was this fabulous, charming person, but he was also incredibly corrupt, and of course indicted in the US and ultimately fled to Northern Cyprus, which is where he's from. And then they made a film about him, Backstabbing for Beginners, if you've seen it, with Ben Kingsley.
Haven't, but I will watch.
The Pasha character is fashioned on him. So, throughout life, I've had this opportunity to meet some really interesting characters along the way.
That's almost a novel about the hotel, right?
Right.
You could write a novel about just who lived in the hotel with you.
You could. There are definitely some interesting people.
Is your immediate family all in Egypt still?
Extended family.
Extended.
My parents have passed on.
Okay.
So I have a sister in Glasgow in the UK, and then extended family, sort of aunts and uncles and cousins and in Egypt.
Well, you took us on an incredible journey with those slides, and you've led an incredibly interesting professional career. You talked a lot about business resilience and ethics and a little bit about cultural differences, but I wonder if you could touch on those just a little bit more with your global experiences. In terms of your board work and what you're doing currently, which you're still doing international board work, correct?
That's right. So I serve on the Board Risk and Compliance Committee of a Saudi multinational independent power and water producer called Aqua Power. So the Board Risk and Compliance Committee is what it says on the tin. It's our job to advise the board on, how the company is identifying, managing and monitoring, and its risks, and of course the overall compliance program. And this is something I think a lot of people think about places like Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, and they have a perception in their mind. And certainly if you read the DOJ press releases on FCPA prosecutions, you see familiar names of countries coming up in places like Nigeria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or even Saudi Arabia. You can go to Transparency International and pull up a corruptions perception index list of ranking. But the reality is always much more nuanced than that. Corruption is not part of Arab culture. It's not part of African culture any more than it is part of European culture. This is opportunity and lack of controls and lack of a proper corporate culture, combined with other societal factors like poverty,
Sure,
geopolitical issues or local political issues, whatever it is that contributes to that. So I think one of the things that's important, and I think it goes back to sort of some of the discussion we had about traditional culture here in Australia and Indigenous culture here in Australia, is when you're working with boards or with people or with partners or whoever it is internationally, is to try to understand the roots within the culture of where the values come from and
Sure.
connect on a common values ground. As opposed to approach it as sort of like, well, we know that Iraq is a horribly corrupt country. Let's have a look under the bonnet, show us what you're hiding, how do you do this kind of business, that kind of business. I think it's really important to connect on a values basis and drive it from a values basis. And boards are very diverse. If
Sure.
you've got a good board,
Yeah,
you've got a diverse board.
if they've done it right.
If they've done it right. So connecting to board members and getting them and focusing their minds on the issues that are really going to affect the business, in terms of its impactfulness, both for its shareholders, but for its wider stakeholder group as well, society, employees, customers, whoever it is. That's really, really key. So that's something that I try to bring from all those experiences to
Yeah,
bear in those
I like to
discussions.
think of you as infiltrating some of these Middle Eastern countries and bringing some Northeastern ethos to them in your subtle ways, but also through your global expertise that you've had for 22 years around the globe.
No, thank you. Well, the funny thing about some of these countries is the more you infiltrate them, the more they infiltrate you. They get into your heart and they become part of you as well. And, I hope that, as I was saying, whether it's the Kurds in Kurdistan or the Afghans or whatever, I hope that, people always, whether they follow a public interest law route or, they become international civil servants or whatever, or they go the corporate route, I hope they always have at heart, the people and society, in the countries that their organizations are operating. And these aren't risks that are specific to corporations. We saw with Oxfam, we saw with Save the Children, all these horrible,
Sure.
Scandals of sexual exploitation in places like Haiti. This can happen anywhere if you're not driving the culture properly. And it doesn't matter whether it's a for-profit organization or a private organization. Or a not-for-profit organization. So
I have just a couple more questions. Do you get antsy after a couple years in one location?
I never got antsy in Dubai, believe it or not, because I was always traveling. In fact, for my permanent residency application for Australia, I had to give them a detailed record of everywhere I'd been in the last 10 years. So you can imagine how interesting that was, right? North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, Iraq, they're all on there. And then, of course, I had to explain why I went to these places and what I was doing exactly.
Sure.
And, fortunately, I got cleared. But I remember in 1 year when I was doing that spreadsheet, in 1 year, I think I'd done, first of all, the 10 years, it was about 280 trips. So an average of 28 trips a year. In 1 year, I'd done 36. Since moving here, I haven't moved. I haven't moved out of 200-kilometer radius. So this is a new experience for me.
Yeah.
The Australian border is closed. We're not allowed to leave.
Are you doing a lot of your work via virtual?
All like this, with this background, and a lot of late nights, because the time difference can be quite brutal, especially I had a project recently where I was advising a board in relation to a rather difficult situation. There'd been a whistleblower allegation against the fairly senior executives in the company. So it wasn't something that management could handle because they were implicated by the allegation. So the board had to handle it, and I was asked to help with that and progress an investigation and bring in forensic sort of investigators to go through emails and things like that, and manage a law firm, things that general counsel would have done if they were able, if it wasn't if it was below that level.
Right.
That involved working with people in the US, working with people in London. And so as we head into, we're now 14 hours apart, you and I.
Yes.
We're about to head into a period. You will fall back and we will spring forward. It'll be a 16-hour time difference. So it's definitely a new way of doing things for me, but much more carbon friendly, I have to say. So back to the climate change initiative. This is my contribution to climate change.
We've slowed down Mohamed for several years. Jet fuel. So my next and probably final question is, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? What's around the corner for you? What do you have yet that you want to accomplish?
I'm on this board journey. I really want to sort of build my board credentials and be a director as opposed to a consultant to boards or on a board committee. And so that's where I'm sort of, trying to guide myself. I think I still have a few years left of sort of doing the general counsel kind of thing. I absolutely loved being a part of an executive team, a senior leadership team, and having that seat at the table. And then my advice to Northeastern, fresh graduates or students is, if you're considering a corporate career, never settle for a legal role that, reports to the CFO, that isn't on the leadership team, where you don't have the ability to drive and influence the strategy. I hate companies, and I see it often in my work, that view lawyers, they're sort of, the back office lawyers. When we need you, we'll come to you. You stay in your lane, don't, and they come up with these alluring terms like business partnering. The business legal partner. It's like, what are you talking about? This is the business. If you get this wrong, you have no business.
Right.
So seat at the table, drive the agenda, drive the strategy, contribute on strategy. Certainly, this was one of the things I learned when I was, doing the bar exam in Massachusetts. Lawyers can have input on business issues. And it's not that, that's not an ethical violation. That's right. You can do it and you should do it. So I think I probably have maybe a little bit more time. We'll see what happens with this Australian chapter, because Australia is a different market, and, I'm going to tackle it by the horns.
Yeah.
So I'll get qualified, hopefully, and then we'll go from there. I am looking for board opportunities here as well, with not-for-profits and with corporations. They don't call it Fortress Australia for nothing. It's not easy to get in, but I hope to have something to add and continue.
I'm sure
with
you
that
do,
journey.
and you will. And I found this to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. I appreciate you spending some time with us and zooming out with us and sharing your insights and your career path with our alumni, our students, and our staff and faculty. And I'm just so grateful that you made some time for us today. I wish you all the best as you study for the Australian exam. And I'm sorry you had to take property twice, but it sounds like you've now accomplished what you need to accomplish in terms of the extra credits. And I just really appreciate your time, Mohamed, and enjoyed learning about your pathway.
Well, thank you very much, Mielle. It's always great to talk to you. And, you know, I loved coming to our 20th reunion back in 2019.
Right.
It was the last big hurrah that I went to before the pandemic.
It's like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. But, you know, we're in a new world now, and I'm happy to connect with Northeastern alums and students, and, you know, in any way I
Thank you.
can
I
contribute.
really appreciate that. Yes. Well, stay safe and healthy, and stay in touch.
Thanks, Mielle. You too.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.